Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming out on this warm summer day. We are in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium for History is Lunch. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. A few notes. All MDAH sites will close tomorrow for the Independence Day holiday, but the museums will reopen for regular business on Friday, July 5th. On Thursday of next week, the Museum of Mississippi History will have the inaugural History Happy Hour from 5 to 7 p.m. The Lucky Hand Blues Band will perform. There will be a cash bar, free eats, and flash tours highlighting alcohol and Prohibition-era artifacts in the museum. So I hope you will join us for that. And then the next day, July 12th at 11 a.m., the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum will have the next installment of Freedom Song Friday, this one featuring Canton civil rights veteran Flonzie Brown Wright. And remember that you can support the work of the museums and receive free admission with annual memberships. There are brochures over there on the shelf by the refreshments. I hope that you will join us back here next week for History's Lunch when Katie McKee will present Mississippi in the work of Sherwood Bonner. If you don't know Katie McKee yet, she is the new director of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi. She follows Ted Owenby there, and we're looking forward to having her down for this. Today, though, we are delighted to have Christopher M. Spann, the author of From Cotton Field to Schoolhouse, African American Education in Mississippi, 1862 to 1875. Spann earned his Ph.D. from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he now serves as Associate Dean for Graduate Programs in the College of Education and Associate Professor in the Department of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership. His book, From Cotton Field to Schoolhouse, has just been reissued by the University of North Carolina Press in softcover. Help me welcome Christopher Spann.
Good afternoon. I hope my northern accent don't throw you off too much, so I apologize. All my people are from Hinds County on my dad's side. But after a generation and a half, you kind of lose it. So people have been correcting me the last few days that I've been here. And I'm still struggling a little bit, so bear with me. I do want to kind of open by first saying thank you to Chris Goodwin for the invitation to speak. The book now is in its 10th year. I enjoyed writing it tremendously. It's not only a great opportunity to present in this venue with you guys, but it just reconnected me with an old colleague and friend, Ann, who was an archivist in the department, Mississippi Department of Archives and History, who really helped me identify most of these source considerations for this study. Is kind of sitting in the audience, and as I was mingling and chit-chatting with people, she had said her name. It didn't make much of a connection, and then she said just one more phrase, and immediately I said, "I'm sorry, what's your name again?" And there was an instant connection. I knew that was Ann from the archives who kind of helped me with my research. So I want to say thank you publicly for all the research that you did for me, so I could do the research for this book. That being said, I want to read an essay that I've written. It's really kind of a continuation of this study, but if you read the book, what you'll see is in the acknowledgments and in the epilogue, those are bookends for the research. But the acknowledgments and the epilogue is really kind of breadcrumbs to my own historical past. And it's the impetus as to what made me want to write the book on Black education in Mississippi during and after the Civil War. And so I have my family here, my wife. We've been together 23 years, married 18. I realize now she's not a quitter, so I appreciate that. So I have my niece who's with me on my mother's side, Veronica. I have my sister Priscilla, who still lives in Hinds County, and she's super proud of it, so in that sense. And I have my son Langston, who I really hope that when he hears this essay, he sees a little bit of himself, a little bit of his dad, but he has that longer connection to kind of the important roots of coming out of Mississippi and what it means. So I'm going to spend about 30 minutes kind of going through this essay, and then I look forward to Q&A with you guys. So let me begin. Family recalled him being smart, troublesome, inquisitive, wily, and charismatic. Short, wiry, thin, unusually strong, and handsome. He possessed a will and determination everyone admired, a child with an old soul and wit, they would say. Sam, only attended school to about the 3rd grade and never learned much beyond a little reading, writing, and arithmetic. He was barely literate. Throughout childhood and adolescence, he boisterously bragged about his limited formal schooling, prideful ignorance, adults would say. By today's educational standards, Sam would be labeled an elementary school dropout. Truth be told, labels were unnecessary. He was. Aside from a few questioning elders, no one cared enough to monitor his school attendance or hold Sam accountable, not even Sam. So he ditched school all the time because he just didn't like it. Decades later, as life repeatedly tested him as an adult, Sam's limited learning served as a stinging reminder of lost opportunities and forced denials. It was one of his deepest regrets. Through it all, however, he always seemed to value education, passing its importance on to his children and grandchildren. Almost all of Sam's learning occurred outside of school. Experience was his best teacher. Knowledge came from long, intense conversations with elders and family and friends, and from unnecessary and sometimes unavoidable encounters and skirmishes with bigots, from self-immersions into the unknown, trial and error and failure, lots of failure. By age 10, he convinced himself that more could be learned and gained from experiences outside of school than in it, so Sam quit going to school altogether. Many factors pushed and pulled Sam out of school. Disinterest, poverty, and life circumstances were the biggest. He lived in a time and place where young black boys and girls were still expected to labor in cotton fields during daylight hours, a requirement during slavery that transitioned almost undisturbed well beyond emancipation and into the 20th century. They were expected to sharecrop and work as domestics as soon as they came of age, sometimes to help family make the ends almost meet. So Sam helped out. He quit school and started picking cotton. He wasn't alone. Added young hands plucking at white fibers in bowls from August to November meant heavier bales weighed at sundown. When it came time to settle up with white landowners at year's end, it meant the possibility of a little extra family income, or maybe some pocket money, a better Christmas, or a clearing of a debt. For young black children in Sam's situation, schooling inconveniently coincided with the cotton harvest. Generations of white expectations was another factor pulling Sam out of school and forcefully shoving him and his kind into cotton fields. Whites didn't have to know him personally to presume he'd pick cotton throughout his life. Everyone expected the young Sams of Mississippi to pick cotton. Everyone. Particularly someone in Sam's profile. He was young, truant, hard-headed, restless, and black, albeit just being black was more than enough to qualify him for picking cotton. Century-long laws and customs in Mississippi determined Sam was perfect for cotton fields or prison. Wasn't that why black folk were brought to Mississippi? To pick cotton? History books said so. Generations of Mississippi school children learned through their textbooks that blacks were, quote-unquote, perfectly suited for slave labor, particularly picking cotton. Maybe fortunate for him, Sam missed these school lessons. Playing hooky so much, he wasn't there long enough to learn these historical facts and interpretations. Still, he intimately knew them. It wasn't something he needed to learn from a textbook. As far back as the stories went, every black person Sam knew or heard of picked cotton. Everyone. Even the black landowners or black escapees to the north he knew, at some point in their life, picked cotton. Had Sam skipped his early induction into sharecropping and decided to stay in school, going beyond the elementary grades were a long shot. In the late 1930s, there were few schools beyond the elementary grades for black children. Officials who revamped Mississippi's education system in the 1890s built it with the intent of black children replacing their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents in cotton fields. Of the state's 82 counties, less than a dozen provided education up to or beyond 8th grade for colored children. Schools were expected to train people for their occupational station in adult life, and for Mississippi blacks, virtually all stations led them back to cotton fields. This was a far cry from the educational expectations of formerly enslaved Mississippians, whose demands for literacy and access to schools following emancipation guided the language and drafting of the constitutional amendments and school laws that established Mississippi's first real public education system in the late 1860s. They envisioned the school system, built to include them and their children, would liberate the formerly enslaved from cotton, not educate them for it. Now, Sam and his people were from Bolton, Clinton, and Jackson. The ancient earth and winding, twisting roads in Bolton and Clinton symbolically told the story of black progress in the state. There wasn't much of it. A person could walk a mile, but because of all the twists and turns in the road, it looked like they had maybe moved about 100 feet. Still, the mile-long walk exhaustively felt more like 10. Sam knew a family and fellow Mississippians who escaped cotton fields and the exhaustion and heat associated with them. They creatively carved out their own paths and lives in places like New York City and Chicago. They appeared to travel the nation, even the world, without restriction. A restless Sam wanted their life and what they had. Otis, an uncle on his daddy's side, learned to use his hands to hard pluck at piano keys in juke joints rather than white fibers in cotton fields. After gaining mastery of the instrument, he became the piano man for McKinley Morganfield, far better known to his listeners as the Great Muddy Waters. Uncle Otis even formed his own blues band and thereafter became a solo artist. Sterling, a younger cousin on his mama's side, escaped the death spiral of sharecropping cotton because of an overzealous auntie who paid for him to stay in school longer than anyone else in the family's history. So the story goes, a bootlegger aunt paid for him to attend Holy Ghost High School in Jackson. Holy Ghost was a small private school that prided itself on being an alternative public education. It gave smart, ambitious black children a safe space to learn, gain confidence, and obtain a rare possession, a high school diploma. It shielded them from the harsh realities of cotton's vice-like grip. Sterling didn't fail them. He couldn't. He became the first in the family to not only graduate high school, but college. He would go on to become a world-renowned poet and professor of English at a major university in Chicago. Sam knew alternatives to cotton picking existed, but he also knew he wasn't his uncle or cousin. He possessed neither artistic mastery nor educational persistence to transcend and escape the trappings and tripwires of Jim Crow Mississippi. But he did possess something Uncle Otis, cousin Sterling, and virtually all other family members had: tenacious grit. Alongside manhood, he had mastered this by the age of 15. Sam epitomized the attributions ascribed in I'm a Man by Muddy Waters. It's as if the blues man and all the affirmations of manhood written in the song had Sam in mind, or at least Sam thought so. He survived the loss of his father, immense childhood violence and hunger, and sharecropping all before the age of 15. That was a victory in itself. Like others, he trailblazed his own way out of Mississippi. Along the way, he found his life calling too. His passion for wanting something more than a life of cotton field blues and denials led him to lead his people out of Mississippi and toward Chicago, Black America's mythic promised land. It led them to overpriced apartments and low-paying jobs, but it was better than cotton. Muddy and BB's blues blaring on Sam's car radio reinforced his conviction to leave his ancestral home because he saw no future for him and his children beyond cotton. Sam loved the blues, especially recordings by Muddy Waters and B.B. King, lyrics sung with gravelly voices with deep southern drawls, and the rhythmic sounds of harmonicas and acoustic guitar stirred his soul. They reminded him of home. He loved the blues so much that it really was hard to know which came first: Sam, the blues songs he loved, or Sam's imitation of them. Muddy and BB sang the story of his life. Just listen to the titles of some of their most famous songs strung together. How could they not be about Sam? A managed boy, sometimes tomcat, hoochie coochie man who just wanted to make love to every woman he met. A man-child in the promised land, rolling and tumbling because he just can't be satisfied, who sometimes feel like going home when he's got his mojo working, but it just won't work on the women he desired. A prodigal son and man who sometimes felt like nobody loved him but his mama, and she could be jiving too. Sam was the family's key to the highway, as Muddy would say. His motivations and actions led to his family's out-migration. It moved them away from cotton sharecropping and Jim Crow. And in some ways, it fulfilled his grandmother's dream. Now, Sterling loved Sam like a big brother. They were kinfolk. He affectionately wrote of Sam's genius and generosity through his poetry. Despite their divergent paths and age differences, they remained close throughout life. And rarely did they call each other by their birth names. Sam was Buster to Sterling, and Sterling was Lil Bruh to Buster. Buster was like the family's Moses or Harriet Tubman to Little Bruh. Buster left Mississippi in the early 1950s and repeatedly returned south to help family migrate north to places like Chicago, Little Bruh included. He brought him to Chicago in 1962, and his mama and sister soon thereafter. Quote, Buster is vocabulary of strength, end quote, Sterling wrote in one of his poems. Quote, he drained blood from his veins for his family. Brought me north to Chicago first, he recalled, from dawn to midnight, from Mississippi through Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois' lower parts, end quote. Like a yo-yo master effortlessly orchestrating an orb up and down a string, Buster masterfully yo-yoed vehicles up and down interstate highways of I-55 and I-57 to move family north. Him securing work as a long-haul driver helped. It gave him a vehicle and a reason to be in and around Mississippi. Slowly but surely, more and more family hitched a ride and their dreams to his 18-wheeler and followed him north. The 12-plus hour rides allowed Buster time to catch up with family and friends. It also gave him an opportunity to ease the minds of family unsure about leaving Mississippi and everything they knew behind. Buster understood their concerns. They reminded him of his first trip north. Sensing discomfort, maybe even regret, he tried to pass the time and lessen anxieties by telling family stories or self-effacing jokes. Or he turned the dial on his truck's radio to find a good blues channel they could hum to or sing. He had an uncanny ability and gift to make people feel welcomed and heard. The short, skinny, braggadocious, and charismatic child with very little schooling grew into a slightly taller, stout, and even more charismatic and handsome man. Family barely recognized him when he first returned home. Sam had grown up. But once he spoke and fired off a few jokes, they all knew Buster was home. He had a giant-sized personality that never let his height, size, poverty, or skin color bother him. And his personality was infectious. It pulled on people like gravity and placed him at the center of all things happening. He was a family man and a man of many families and possessed all the acumens of a seasoned leader and a head of state. He was quick-tempered and sometimes violent when things didn't go his way, especially when he felt disrespected or he felt his family was under assault. Rarely did he show deference to anyone besides the family's apron-clad matriarchs that raised and cared for him. He was well-dressed and carried himself with dignity. He was a proud, loud-laughing, hard drinker. He was confident, funny, charming, and loving, sometimes too much and too often. And family said he was hopelessly optimistic, a people's first person, deeply empathic and generous to a fault, and everyone seemed to love him for it. Sam knew people. He learned to read them far better than he ever learned to read books. Decades of studying and tinkering with human behavior helped him understand people and how to engage them. He knew the worth of a smile. It diffused nonsense and created opportunities. So he always smiled and tried to make people smile. He knew the value of a well-timed joke and a personal story. So he always tried to make people laugh when they felt like shouting or crying, or he'd tell a story to change a person's mood. He's a great storyteller, as Sterling would say. He said, had Buster lived in another era, he wrote of his big play brother, he is Homer or Chaucer or Shakespeare. And man, could that man lie. Not in the untruth sense Sterling would warn, but in the exaggerated or tall tale genre. Give Buster a grain of sand, he jested, and cousin tell you about the whole beach. Buster had a remarkable ability to translate all experiences through his voice. He learned this skill by listening to and mimicking his elders, particularly his grandmother, Miss Mattie. Miss Mattie was his mama's mama, and she shared stories of Mississippi the way she learned them, by way of mouth. Sometimes she told stories by night fires like the olden days, or on family porch swings or dinner tables after Sunday service. Part Chickasaw Indian, she spent her advanced years telling and retelling family stories of her people and how they came to Mississippi. Most ignored Miss Mattie or didn't care for what she had to say. Some even thought she might be a little senile because she talked about things few could understand. But Miss Mattie knew Mississippi. It was her home and all she had known since her birth in the 1880s. Mississippi, a land and place where the soil is as rich and fertile as the river that gave the state its name, is long. A place where, if Miss Mattie was commissioned to retell or rewrite the state's history, the chapters she produced would be penned in inks of sweat, tears, blood, and mud. Her study would begin by telling readers of the arrival of wealthy and poor white men from the Atlantic states, from Maine to Georgia, with ambitions of generating more wealth or striking it rich through the unfortunate dealing, ventures, and trades of cotton and slaves. It would tell of wars with Cherokee and Choctaw and Chickasaw and Natchez and Shawnee and Creek people, of land negotiations with Frenchmen and Spaniards, and of the conquest, extermination, forced outmigration of red men for the land redistribution and settlement of ambitious slaveholding white men. It would articulate the frustrations of generations of poor whites who hated slavery almost as much as black folk, and for strikingly similar reasons, except one. Slavery kept them landless, impoverished, and ignorant, and they wanted something more for their children than simply a badge of whiteness. Her book would be replete with stories of how forced migrations, sales, and separations of enslaved people to and from Mississippi repeatedly destroyed families. Her volume would chronicle the birth of sorrow songs that evolved into the blues, of Africans still being imported and sold up the mouth of the Mississippi from enslaver markets in New Orleans to places like Natchez and Vicksburg and Jackson, only for them to be smuggled and resold up other rivers like Yazoo and Big Black and Little Tallahatchie, even as late as the start of the Civil War. Her book would share stories of emancipation and hope, black codes and violence, reconstruction and revenge, and freed people, bound in new ways to white people, white power, white land, and white cotton. Mississippi, a state full of troubled histories and troubled minds. With her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, Miss Maddie recounted the story of her and their Mississippi. Those who listened carefully could begin piecing together the story and chronology of their family's past. Her methodology was primeval. It was a mix of spoken word history with long pauses and emotions and tangential recollections. Put together, it all haphazardly hummed and translated into stories of human suffering and misery. It is important to explain how she made meaning of her memories in words. She didn't tell chronological histories corroborated by source material evidence, the kind of things that you'll see in the book that I wrote over there. She told her stories through testimonials, situations, past and immediate happenings, and memories. Coherency was never her concern. She always left it to her listeners to decipher meaning or decode what she had shared. Miss Maddie saw history as a form of currency or capital to be deposited in the minds of her grandbabies. Now, some could argue her stories were counter-narratives to what a racist Mississippi wanted people to know about her and her people and her kind. She wanted family to know something different than the idea that black people's sole purpose in Mississippi was to pick cotton for another person's profit. In no way did she think Mississippi could treat black folk right. She just had never seen it. So she further assumed that schools were never going to teach her children and grandchildren right. That being said, she unofficially became the family's history teacher. To Buster, Little Bruh, and the others who sat and listened to her, Miss Maddie's stories were powerful. She was one of their greatest teachers, and she never attended school a day in her life. She spoke of the blues wailed by tired and swollen feet, of broken hearts and dispirited minds. She spoke of people who walked hundreds of miles from the Chesapeake and Carolinas in coffle gangs, chained behind ox carts. People forced to walk and traverse valleys and mountains from Virginia to Georgia, who chopped through thickets and forests in Kentucky and Tennessee, who survived snake bites and dysentery in swamps and marshes in Florida and Louisiana, and who meandered man-made paths in South Carolina and Alabama, carved out by centuries of human activity, all to get to Mississippi so they could pick cotton, slavery's final frontier. In her own words, Miss Maddie shares stories of how these enslaved migrants settled along and around rivers that came to define and codify white supremacy and black subjugation. She'd frighten young listeners with stories of how whites talking about needing extra money made black folk hide their children or want to run away in the stealth at night from their enslaved homes in attempts to keep their families intact. She choked back tears as she shared how cotton ruined and killed black bodies and minds, how the changing colors of fields forced blacks to labor year-round their entire lives for another person's profit, fields that start mud black in winter but progressively turn green after seeding in early spring, then perfectly white mid to late summer, dull brown in late autumn, and then black again. Slavery may have ended, she say, but black folks' lifelong and life-wide bondage to cotton and its landowners carried on. Miss Maddie told these stories until her passing at the age of 103. Her summations of how vast white fields of cotton ruined millions of black lives while simultaneously benefiting 100 million plus lives worldwide always hit home to her two grandbabies, Buster and Little Bruh. They were stories of people denied everything because of enslavement, who started freedom with nothing but personal ambition, and who persistently fought off the intergenerational ill effects and harms of slavery, segregation, debt, hunger, and wrenching, unrelenting violence. If one had to compress Miss Maddie's stories into a singular message, it would be, if you're black and the opportunity presented itself, leave Mississippi immediately. No school in America could teach Buster and Lil Bro what they had learned at Miss Maddie's knee or on her front porch. and both proved to be good listeners and students. They took their grandmother's advice and left Mississippi first chance they could. But beyond the sorrow and pain she shared, the cousins heard other messages that kept families together despite powerful effects continually prying and tearing them apart. Mississippi Blues share stories of both sorrow and jubilee, pain and empowerment. Alongside the pain shared by my dear grandma, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, the two cousins heard stories of family and love and strength and determination, stories of people who made a way out of no way. It was their people walking behind those ox carts from the Carolinas, who tussled with language and codes and each other in the hopes of fitting into an angry and segregated white world, who had frequent private talks with Jesus, pleading with him for a little more comfort and guidance in this life, and requests for remembrances and rewards in the next. Miss Mattie taught them the importance of being kind and available to kinfolk. Family protected family, she say. Sometimes it was all that one had. Forced migrations and forced labor because of slavery's expansion continuously created new worlds and new realities and new families in the black community. Hell, slavery created Mississippi, at least its identity, and led to a war over its most coveted assets, cotton and slaves. The outgrowth of all this disruption and unpredictability was the establishment of an extensive kinship network throughout the slave South. You do know what I mean when I say kinship or kinfolk, right? You know, people who are your people but who really aren't your people, you know what I mean? Kinfolk are people who are not always immediate family, but sometimes they're your last family. Initially a patchwork of people bonded by common experience, most often pain, that united those born, taken, and left behind because of slavery. Kinfolk labored together in cotton fields and picked up or slowed down the pace of hoeing or picking to protect loved ones from the lash. They shared stories of empowerment and family, old and new, by night fires after a hard day of slave labor. Kinfolk sometimes got on your last nerve, but you couldn't stop loving them in their ways. They cared for other people's children, parents, and grandparents as if they were their own. Kinfolk consoled the grieving when loved ones died or were sold away. They cried at burials, gave testimonial affirmation about the dead when the immediate family were too shook or too distraught to speak, shared and contributed what little they had, and reminded enslaved loved ones, especially those fed up and bitter with bondage, that God and his moral judgment were just and final. Kinfolk were like patches of loose, discarded cloth, gathered, assembled, and sewn together to make a quilt of stability in a very unstable world. Unconditional family that provided comfort, shelter, resources, protection, and love. A uniquely American tapestry, stitched together with threads and needles of pain, but interwoven and padded with love, and clearly displayed with affection. Black America's comfort blanket. Kinfolk were the primary reason black people survived 25 decades of enslavement. Like the blues, it's another gift black Americans gave to America. Kinfolk paid for Little Brother's high school education and paved the way to his professorship in world travels. They mustered up the money for Buster to buy a one-way train ticket to Chicago in the hopes of saving his restless soul from cotton fields, prison, or worse. Kinfolk like Buster took family and friends north to escape Mississippi and their own cotton field blues. Miss Mattie incorporated these stories into her narrations and told them as stories of inspiration to the next generation of grandbabies who sat and visited by her side. I know because I was one of them. When Miss Mattie spoke, I saw the grace and power Buster, my daddy, witnessed and told me about. She was a beautiful woman with a beautiful mind, speaking beautifully about her people. I only came to know and learn from her in the last half-decade of her life. At this point, Miss Mattie could barely move and was confined to her bedroom. On visits, I tried not to stare too much at the woman my daddy bragged so much to me about on our long car rides to and from Hinds County. I just didn't want to be rude. Whereas other grandchildren exhausted themselves with games of tag and sprint races outside, I wanted to sit with Miss Mattie until I was forced to play outside with kinfolk. I preferred her stories over being pulled and grabbed and wrestled to the dirt by sweaty country cousins I barely knew. Her stories spurred my curiosity and passion for history and the desire to know how the past impacts the present. Studying Miss Mattie's history and the history of her histories in the academy have proven difficult. How does one tell or write the histories of stories never written down or heard only as a child? And I'm going to pause here because I think this museum, just what I said, where the stories aren't written down, but you still got to tell it. I think this museum did a phenomenal job doing that. And so, phenomenal job. How does one corroborate the reliability, accuracy of events or competing claims of truth of both the memories of the teller and listener of these stories? The Academy extensively dismisses her stories as folktales, but if you've studied the specifics of American history, more specifically the African American past, you know they are something more than family myths or legends. Making meaning of Miss Mattie's stories is kind of like studying and then proving the existence of black holes. All kinds of evidence around the periphery or edges of black holes support claims of their existence, but nothing specific that unquestionably proves they're real. Until, of course, a photograph was recently taken of a black hole that finally captures what a century of theories and scientific evidence had already proven. Humanity, at least outside of scientific communities, needed a photograph to believe that not only black holes are real, but that they reside at the center of every galaxy in the universe. The photograph not only confirms their presence, it validated century-long research acknowledging their immense gravitational force and how black holes define the character and movement of all things known and unknown in the visible universe. The same is true of black folk in the history of America, especially in Mississippi. Their people, lived experiences, and stories are at the center of everything that made America, and by default, Mississippi, great. Everything. Centuries of theories, histories, and evidence show their existence, contribution, and gifts, but they have not been captured in a way acceptable to the general public, even though countless photographs exist as proof. Society has yet to accept the centeredness and immense gravitational impact African Americans have had on the making of America and its people. At the center of all things known and unknown in this country are black people. Everything. Considerations of how to treat and include people of African descent since their arrival in 1619, 400 years ago, are at the center of how American society came to define its norms, values, beliefs, people, institutions, economics, and innovation. Even the very definition of freedom itself stems from the treatment of black people at the time of the drafting of two of this nation's most important documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Miss Mattie knew the realities of this centeredness theory all too well. She was essentially the family Stephen Hawking, someone who developed years of deep thought and knowledge and evidence to support her claims, but without possession of a definitive photograph to prove them. Her evidence was a century of stories and experiences, stories that started with her daddy and her daddy's people and kinfolk, formerly enslaved people and their children who shared their life experiences, their histories with and around her when she was a child. Miss Mattie sat and listened and absorbed and made meaning of the knowledge they shared. She methodically and meticulously tried to pass it on to others in the hopes that they too would listen and pass it on further. She was the culmination of intergenerational knowledge, amassed, processed, and passed on for future generations of listeners and storytellers to absorb, build upon, and share. Thank God a few people listened and shared. And I am here today presenting in this venue and on this platform to pass on the knowledge and wisdom that she shared. Her stories shape the histories I write. They guide my weary mind and pen when I feel like giving up or researching and writing a different kind of history. It pains me to share as a tenured professor of education and history at a major university, the second in the family to become a professor, the first on my daddy's side, that my memories of Miss Mattie's memories are just as fragmented as the stories she told me. At best, I share stories of her stories as told to me by my late father, Samuel Spann, Buster, our cousins Sterling Plump, Lilbra, and the last living family, kinfolk of their generation. I was a child when Miss Mattie died. I was less than 2 months shy of being 16 years old when my daddy died. He beat cotton, but he couldn't beat cancer. He was almost 58 years old when Jesus, as the blues singer Mississippi Fred McDowell wailed and moaned, made up his dying bed. But I entered adulthood in the academy determined to find a way to tell their stories and lived experiences the way they expressed them to me, unapologetically. And I haven't as of yet. I have written a number of histories on the African American experience, most specifically on the educational experience of formerly enslaved Mississippians, but I have yet to tell and write the history of my Mississippi people. This is the first step in a long struggle to do so. The structures of the academy, The rules of evidence in academic research and writing, and my own personal hesitancies have simply kept me from writing this narrative. But the more I research this aspect of my past, the more I realize the attention, structure, and voice it needs, and more importantly, deserves. Sam's cotton field blues were uniquely his, but a million more Sams await discovery, research, and articulation. Together, they tell the story of how cotton impacted and defined people's lives, how it led to their out-migrations, how it kept mothers and grandmothers attentive to the ways their babies and grandbabies were being taught and treated, how it made them truth-sayers and family teachers like Miss Mattie. Still, for me, the personal hesitancies beyond the academy come with a strange and uncomfortable truth to acknowledge. Ironically, the pressures Cotton put on my dad to leave Mississippi created the conditions for me to come into this world. It made me. Without Cotton, there is no restlessness, out-migration, courting of a white Indiana girl, or birth of their biracial child who would be the first in the family to earn a doctorate and write a history of Mississippi's cotton fields and schoolhouses. It's hard to concede, but without Cotton and all the strife and challenges associated with it, there's no me. It's taken me 25 years to draft the beginnings of a history family has asked me to write. I promise it won't take me 25 years to finish it. I will no longer fight my academic mind. I will, as Miss Mattie would say, just do it, baby, just do it. And just as I have used the tools I've learned and honed as a historian to write the educational history of African Americans in general, I will do the same for the lived experiences of people who made me, me. I will fulfill a kinfolk request and do as Cousin Sterling asked of me at a party celebrating the completion and earning of my doctorate. He gifted me a 3-page poem he wrote about my father and our people, in which he affectionately entitled Cousin, and beseeched upon me a call of action. As I glanced deeply at the poem that sketched together meaning, attributions, and names of our family's past, Sterling cleared his voice loud enough to break my focus and shift my attention toward him. When we made eye contact, he spoke firm but softly a few words I don't think I'll ever forget. He said, "Chronicler, chronicle our history." I will, Cousin Sterling. Kinfolk promise. I will. Thank you.
Time for questions. Raise your hand. Bring the microphone to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for being here. In your work, you mentioned the idea of blacks' quest for citizenship. Mm-hmm. And could that be the problem with most Americans in their heads, that we are not... they can't accept black people as deserving respect, appreciation, and being treated humanely? And will you speak to the 600 years of the Moors' rule over Spain?
I don't know if I can speak to the 600 years of Moors' rule over Spain. I don't even know I can speak to 6 years of that. But I will try to tackle the first part. In the book that you're referring to, one of the questions was African Americans seeking citizenship, full, equal citizenship. And if you think about the transition from slavery to freedom, if this was 1858, most African Americans would presume that in Mississippi, because there's less than 1,000 free blacks in the state of Mississippi in the 1860 census. So of the 400 and nearly 40,000 blacks that are in the state who are enslaved, they never could have imagined emancipation would happen within 6 years. That would be, that just would not happen. But then you have the Civil War that begins, right? So you have South Carolina that starts it, and you see Mississippi and Louisiana follow suit, really close second and third. And here you see kind of some type of intervention that says the nation is either going to be reunited, but slavery is still, whether it's going to be there or not. That's the question. To anyone in the South, the question is, the North is going to do away with expansion. We can't go beyond where we're at. And so if that's the case, we will create our own nation. And so you saw that push. So we're either going to have two neighboring nations wrangling over this question of slavery. We're going to have one that's immediately reunited with a compromise over slavery. Or what we ended up with was a war that is eventually led to the abolition of slavery. But the black community could not envision that actually happening in 1858. But in 1862, at the start of my study, before the Emancipation Proclamation, they could predict that that was going to happen. So before you would have Abraham Lincoln in January 1st of 1863 issued the proclamation, those seeds were already being sown in Mississippi. That you literally had more than 40,000 African Americans who were enslaved on the move. That once they heard that Grant's army was in Corinth, then they're moving to the north. When they heard that he had moved down to Vicksburg, they're moving over there. When they heard that he and Sherman were in Natchez, they were moving there. So that mass movement led to a kind of disruption that precipitated the language that you're beginning to see in the Emancipation Proclamation. So as we walk through like the museum, you see a piece of that history that's kind of taking place. And it doesn't end, because you can go 3 generations, 4 generations out, you see the same type of empowerment of people in the civil rights era who said, you know, we envision something different than what is actually being offered. And we will work collectively with anybody who wants to help us develop that vision. So once you see the Emancipation Proclamation take place, there's no guarantee that slavery would be abolished. But the push was for this concept called citizenship. For the average person who is enslaved, they wanted to be treated as an equal with dignity. If it started with citizenship, then so be it. But the whole push was about equality. And even now, you think about those songs, as I was talking with Chris Goodwin earlier, the Mississippi Freedom Summer and the SNCC Freedom Singers, they didn't say, I woke up this morning with my mind set on civil rights. They said, I woke up this morning with my mind set on what? Freedom. And so freedom summer, freedom songs, you know, so I can't even find the word civil rights in any of those things. But if it's a stepping stone to the fullness of what it means to be equal, and we're still striving for that. We're not there. We're closer, but we're not there. Collectively, we can get there a lot faster. So that's the push. But I will come back and talk about the Moors.
Thank you for your presentation, sir. On the one hand, you have the Freedmen's Bureau, created as a federal institution, created to assist slaves, ex-slaves, in their quest for improvement in their lives, whether it's education or jobs, health services, whatever. You have the Freedmen's Bureau trying to do what it can as a federal institution to help slaves. On the other hand, you have the black codes,
right,
which is going to try to impede the progress of ex-slaves.
Right.
To what extent is the Freedmen's Bureau able to at least do what it can for education, as opposed to the codes that black codes are going to try to present,
sure,
to prevent? Which is better able to impact the lives of the blacks in terms of their education?
Well, that's an excellent question, and you gave a great summation of probably one of the first tensions that we see as Mississippi was first under military rule and then trying to come out from under military rule and what it would mean. But what you saw on both sides was an interpretation of the 13th Amendment. Here's the Freedmen's Bureau, the Bureau for Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And it's not just there to represent free people in their quest from slavery into freedom. It's there to aid anyone who's been displaced because of the war, anyone who's abandoned land and property because of the war, anyone who's felt some sense of despotism because of the war. And in Mississippi, the aid extended nearly equal in the first year that the Freedmen's Bureau was here. But there are more people in the room today than there were people on the ground in the entire state of Mississippi as it related to the Freedmen's Bureau. So imagine us trying to cover the entire state of Mississippi and all the needs after the nation had just gone to war. Now, the war might have ended early in Mississippi, relatively speaking. Once Sherman kind of went through the state, destroyed the railroads and the different ways, they moved that campaign further and further east. But nonetheless, you have to kind of recover from it. We don't have enough people in the room to deal with that. But what we do have is a lot of people who are simply opposed to the idea of emancipation or the war being over, or that somehow there's some measured equality between whites and blacks. That concept of race ran so deep that it caused people to also pick up and interpret the 13th Amendment. So those who wrote the black codes, they followed to the letter of the law the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. There was a clause in the middle of it. It said, except in the case of crime, could a person be kind of put in a more permanent state of servitude. And so they took that to say that if you actually write a law that makes everything a person who's free commit a crime, then we are following the 13th Amendment. We've acknowledged slavery. We haven't acknowledged it in our Constitution. I don't think Mississippi does that until like 2005. So like formally, but notwithstanding, we're acknowledging it, but we're acknowledging it with this clause that except in the case of crime. So if you cross the street the wrong way, if you're a vagrant, if you do whatever, then you're going to jail and someone can purchase you out of slavery and then you have to work off the debt for what it costs to get you out of slavery. So the Freedmen's Bureau tried to push this. The best thing that could have happened to those legislators who wanted to have a reinforcement of the 13th Amendment, that saying Section 2 is not enough because there are these badges and incidents of slavery. What I mean by that is the badge is skin color. One sees one white, one sees one black. But the incidence of slavery is the person owns no land. They have no education. They have no property. They have no access to the courts. They have no access to marriage. They have no access to travel. And these are all incidents because in slavery, African Americans could not do these things. And so when the court was ruling on that Section 2 of the 13th Amendment, it precipitated the push for the 14th and 15th Amendment. So the black codes really ushered in the push on a national campaign to say, we have to do something about this. So again, if you think about in the museum here, the Civil Rights Movement, this is ground zero for the Civil Rights Movement. And the national campaigns grow out of this. But once they brought the media and the cameras here, you start seeing that in 4 short months, Freedom Summer, it changed America for the difference. In 13 short years, it changed the entire region and the nation. The black codes, in some ways, as destructive as they were, they put the impetus on people to say, this cannot be the interpretation of the 13th Amendment. And we're going to move forward to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we'll create more laws for greater equality. So in some ways, the black codes may have helped more in a strange way than the Freedmen's Bureau, but because of the warped mindedness of it. So don't go out and create black codes. I don't want anybody to misunderstand what I'm saying.
Okay, let me also thank you for your presentation. Given your history from the cotton field to the schoolhouse, and also what you have presented as your family history, the unfolding of your family history, I'm going to assume that you keep abreast enough about what's going on in this state right now regarding education. And I'm wondering if you can, if indeed that's the case, if that assumption is valid, I'm wondering if you can, in fact, take this history, this family memoir here, and provide and use it as a context to essentially talk about the kind of narrative, the kind of public narrative that ought to shape the way in which people in this state talk about education, given what we have now in the 21st century here.
Well, your question is almost as tough as the 600 years of Morris. But actually, I'm going to try to take a shot at this one because I do know I followed it forward. Let's think about what I just shared in here, that if the schools aren't, if schools aren't treating you right, then how can you expect them to teach you right? That's kind of the message that Miss Maddie was sharing there. And so she decided she would supplement the education of family members, even if they weren't going to school, to think of themselves as something more than what people were thinking of them in society and life, cotton pickers. And so in that sense, those textbooks, she's not wrong. She's never even picked up probably one of those textbooks. But she knows from the Riley kind of textbook of school uses from 1900 all the way up to 1980, the textbooks in the schools were deeply sympathetic to the Confederate cause. and what that meant, and deeply resistant to the acknowledgement of African Americans beyond kind of the periphery, rather than seeing them in this kind of centeredness argument that you saw me just push in my essay. But she's supplementing it with that. Now, when you go through that long history, you can see that it's kind of like, who is it, James Lowen and was it Charles Sallis, who would write that first textbook, Conflict and Change, that was clearly a revision of anything that was being offered by Bettersworth and others in that long history. But when you get to Brown v. Board of Education, you saw the state do some interesting things. They removed education from being compulsory by law in the state. They actually went through the processes to make sure that the state is no longer responsible for public education. They pushed a freedom of choice plan that created this long division between disproportionately people of color going to public schools and whites sending their children to private schools, in many ways at the expense of the public tax dollar. All of those things have been chronicled by historians along the way. I think the most recent example is the ballot initiative that you had just recently, and the confusion that was created just along the ones who created the ballot initiative to put education back into the Constitution, and then just about a month before the vote, you had people leading the campaign to confuse the hell out of people as to what they should or shouldn't be voting for. Like one's ballot initiative 42, one's ballot initiative 808, and so you got all of this confusion. So somewhere in there is still a tension as to what role should public education play to advance the people of Mississippi. And I actually think that is truly up to you to make that decision. You collectively, that you know what is best for your children and grandchildren. But I wouldn't say go the isolated way of Miss Maddie. I would say go the collective way. She knew that she could probably only have these conversations with her family on her front porch. She couldn't take this down the road and have that conversation. Nobody should deceive themselves in this room as to what happens if you are super outspoken in Mississippi and you're a person of color. So she knew that, but she would do her best to kind of protect her children, almost to the point that she says you should probably leave. Now that's an interesting clause. That shouldn't be the case here today. How do we, it's kind of like what Maya Angelou would say. It's like we should study how we're more alike than we are unalike. And then what does that mean? And I think I was having a conversation with a gentleman in the back of the room before the presentation. It's like our differences may only be this big, but the way we're talking to each other make it seem like it's this big. But we have to figure out the language. We have to tussle with those languages and codes that we all learned a little bit, became part of our habits. And then we have to begin to rethink the way we think about those things to build a new collective whole together. This museum, I think, is, again, that's a great example of that integrated energy, to move people in a direction that offers reconciliation. But our public schools should be doing it as well. And I don't think Mississippi is there yet. But here's the beauty of it. I don't think you're alone, because Illinois isn't either, so we can do it together. I saw a hand way over here. I'm
going to take it over here. I want to mention that Dr. Jim Middleton Harrison here also was one of the contributors to Lowen Sallis's Conflict and Change.
Oh, good.
And is the current president of the Jackson Public School Board.
No, thank you. I'm glad I got it right then.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. So towards the end, you began to discuss how you vowed to chronicle your family's history. So how do you suggest that we as maybe non-academic, everyday Mississippians begin to chronicle our own family's histories to ensure the perpetuity of our family's legacies?
I'm glad that you asked that question, because I was in your shoes before I became these shoes, okay? And it was great people like Ann. As she was helping me find these things, I'm also asking her to help me find some genealogical things. It gave me a chance to understand Mississippi, my family history. But in the process, I got to stay with family. Like I have a great Uncle Herman and great Aunt Lily Mae, who's in Clinton, Mississippi, SPAN, S-P-A-N-N. And I had the opportunity to sit and meet and greet with them. I got a wonderful sister here who gave me kind of shelter. And then I get an opportunity to meet and greet. And hopefully you've seen from my personality, I'm just going to come up and talk to you and first try to find out. We might be 4 degrees from separation or relation. We could be kinfolk is what I was talking about. And so, but what does that actually mean? But you have to have those conversations with folks. And you've got to have good listening ears. And I wouldn't try to judge or presume or understand. I truly would try to listen, because there are times now in my own profession that I struggle with how to deal with conflict and risk management and resolution. And I always take a step back and remind myself, how would someone in my family do this, or an elder that I respect who maybe grew up in that Jim Crow era do this? Like, I have a colleague who grew up in Jim Crow, Alabama. He never has a conflict. And I don't understand how that is even possible. It's like we walk in the room, the whole room is just ripe for conflict. And he walks out, everybody's shaking hands and hugging, and I'm like, this guy is amazing. And I go in there, and everybody want to fight me in the parking lot. You know? So he clearly had learned something along the way, and he's still teaching me those things, but I haven't listened to understand him. But most importantly, I didn't ask the question. Like, explain that to me. So I would say, start with your family. Start with the generation that's your parents and your grandparents. Most of us have a hard time knowing our grandmother's maiden name. So when you think about our own family history, but I would tell you this, ask your schools to start the process. I mean, the best reconciliation process is to learn a little bit about yourself and a little bit about someone else. And you guys go have a conversation together about what it means. And then you share those conversations as you go forward. Those project learning opportunities are abound, and we can do those kinds of things. They're basic things that get us to kind of rethink the way we do. But your breadcrumbs start with your people. And then you move over to the archives, and you ask Mr. Goodwin, how do I now take some of these names and start plugging them in? Or take some of these probate records, or take some of these addresses and locations and start plugging them in. Sterling Plump, on the Emmanuel side, he's traced our family history back to the 1790 census. So when Miss Maddie is sharing those stories of people walking behind ox carts from the Carolinas to Mississippi, those are our great-great-great-grand relatives who are doing that. And so then when I saw them in the archives here, looking at the plantations that were in Clinton, Mississippi, and one particular being Mangella, and you could see the names and the ledgers and the people, I couldn't identify exactly who they were in terms of family, except through the oral history I got from Miss Maddie, and then my great-aunt Carrie, and then from my Aunt Josephine, and from Cousin Waddell and, Cousin Sterling, so Libra. So I think those are the ways that you start to do that, but be patient. And there's a great essay by Alex Haley. Like, his book is Great Roots, but he has an essay on retracing his family history. And the way he went about it, the methods that he used, I think it would be very encouraging for you to read that.
I don't have a tough question for you.
Thank you.
I thought you appreciated it. But I just want to thank you so very much for your presentation, because I can really identify with much of what you said, having grown up in the Mississippi Delta in the middle 30s, late 30s. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And you answered one of the questions I was going to ask you when you mentioned your family name. When you mentioned Otis, I was going to ask you if that was Otis Spann.
Otis Spann, the piano man.
The piano man, right.
Yeah.
And I had the pleasure of knowing Sterling Plump. He gave me a copy of his poems. We'll talk about that later.
Oh, yeah. Sterling is still around.
Yes, I remember when I think he won the lottery or something.
He won the lottery and he stopped talking to us. Yeah. But I think he ran out of money because he's talking to us again.
He knew what to do with the money.
Oh, this is being taped, so take that out of the tape.
But what I wanted to say was, having grown up in that situation and going from the cotton field myself to the academy, I can identify with you. But one of the things that I have seen was a point made by David Halberstam when he came here to participate in the opening of the William Winters building. Okay. And he gave a speech, and he made a point which I thought is a basis of much of our problems. And he said that this country was the only one that imported its colonialism. Mm. And those who were colonialized and the colonializers are still trying to find common ground.
Mm. He never been to Cuba. I'm teasing. He never went south of that.
I wanted to know about the 12, 13 years. Why did it begin at a certain period and end at a certain period?
No, I appreciate the question. I bookended it this way because what I saw was in 1862, black Mississippians who were enslaved started the process of developing schools for themselves. And so we see it as early as we can in Holly Springs and in Corinth, and it goes all the way down to the Gulfport. And we see this development. And what struck me more than anything in the archives is just how soon it was happening. Whereas in Virginia, you see this development, but it's 1863. In North Carolina, it's late 1863. In Missouri, it's 1864. In Texas, 1865. But in Mississippi, it was 1862. So they had their finger on the pulse of what was happening. And so I started to study there for the era of Reconstruction. And in the closing, where you think about Reconstruction, it usually ends in 1877. And so with the presidential election of Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. But in Mississippi, it stops 2 years short because there was a concerted effort on the part of Mississippi Democrats to develop what they call a Mississippi Plan. And through this Mississippi Plan, they were going to take the state back by any means necessary. And it was the most violent campaign of off-cycle, midterm elections that you would see. And literally the election polls were held at gunpoint. What they had realized by 1868 is that Mississippi is a black majority state. It was more enslaved African Americans in Mississippi than there were whites who were free. And once they gained legislative power, they could vote for people who would be favorable to their self-interest. And so you saw kind of at the county level, a disproportionate number of African Americans who would be elected to Senate seats or House seats. You would see that the Secretary of State would come out of Mississippi in James Lynch, and so then John Roy Lynch, and you'd have James Hill, and all of these folks, Thomas Cardozo, they're assuming all these positions of power. Even the lieutenant governor is African American when you have James Lux Alcorn, who is the governor at the time. So this push was to retake Mississippi by any means necessary. And it was the most violent campaign until we get roughly to about the 1890s, and when we see the revamping of the state constitution again. So if you were to leave with one message from that book, it is that black people in Mississippi brought public education to the state. They wrote it into the Constitution in 1868, and it was rewritten in a way that would disfranchise them and deny them equal citizenship in 1890. But between 1875 and 1890, it literally took 15 years to systematically write them out of that Constitution, or rewrite it or repurpose it in a way that would prepare them more for cotton fields than for liberation. And so that kind of development, and when they wrote that constitutional amendment, the two African Americans that wrote it, they were just adamant that this would be public education for everybody. And they couldn't get it to the point of being a desegregated or integrated system. They could only get it to the point that it would be compulsory. And those were the shifts.
We have come to the top, and actually slightly past the top of another hour. This is a fabulous presentation. I know that Dr. Spann will be glad to answer any questions that you may have that you didn't get a chance to ask during this.
$2.
We have copies of the book for sale over here. It's excellent, and I hope that you'll all come visit. Thank you all for coming. I hope we see you back next Wednesday. Help me thank Dr. Christopher Spann for this book.